Not by a show of hands this morning. Don't raise your hands if you've got an answer to this question. Do any of you have a something that you don't want anybody else to know? The reason I don't want you to raise your hands.
That's everyone.
Does anybody know the password to my tablet?
That's supposed to be something you don't want anybody else to know.
Eddie, that's the password.
Yes! Third time's a charm. We're in. Yeah, make it something you're familiar with. So, we've all got something, right? Something that maybe we don't want anybody else to know. Something maybe from our past or something maybe even from our now. A habit, a temptation, a sin that we would rather we didn't have and we don't want anybody else to know about it. Maybe an addiction to, well, it's just hot water. So, if we have a secret that nobody knows, that's hypocrisy. It's hypocrisy. That makes us hypocrites. If we've got a secret that nobody knows, or something that we don't want anybody else to know about us, then we are hypocrites. Pretending on the outside to be somebody we're not. Pretending to be something that we don't want other people to know. Luke chapter 12 and verse 1. In the meantime, when so many thousands of people had gathered together that they were trampling one another, he began to say to his disciples first. Now, first, get that picture. Many thousands of people have gathered around Jesus that they're trampling one another. This is a crazy, huge, uncontrolled crowd. He turns to his disciples and says, "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Nothing is covered up that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. Therefore, whatever you have said in the dark shall be heard in the light, and what you have whispered in private rooms shall be proclaimed on the rooftops." So verses 2 and 3, to me, are terrifying. Just terrifying. That someday, somehow, some way, my life's going to be on the big screen for all to see. My thoughts, my motives, my actions, all those things I don't want anybody to know, up on the big screen. Verse 4. "I tell you, my friends, do not fear those who kill the body, and after that have nothing more that they can do. But I will warn you whom to fear. Fear him who, after he has killed, has authority to cast into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him. Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies? And not one of them is forgotten before God. Why, even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, you are of more value than many sparrows. And I tell you, everyone who acknowledges me before men, the Son of Man also will acknowledge before the angels of God. But the one who denies me before men will be denied before the angels of God. And everyone who speaks a word against the Son of Man will be forgiven. But the one who blasphemes against the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven. And when they bring you before the synagogues and the rulers and the authorities, do not be anxious about how you should defend yourselves or what you should say. For the Holy Spirit will teach you in that very hour what you ought to say." Going to jump right into the first point. Point 1, fear God. Fear God. Jesus tells us here whom we should fear. Verse 4, he says, "Do not fear those who can kill the body, but after that can do nothing more to you. But I will warn you whom to fear. Fear him who, after he has killed, has authority to cast into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him." Jesus is saying, fear God. Now, I've been taught, and I've taught myself, that we don't actually fear God. We have a reverent awe for God. This word is fear. Terrified. It comes from the word phobos, where we get the word phobia. It's a debilitating fear. It puts you to flight. It's the idea that you've come into the presence of something or someone that so terrifies you that all you want to do is get away. You want to run. You're terrified. Jesus tells us to fear God with a phobos fear. That kind of fear that that brings dread and terror and makes us want to flee his presence. While at the same time, we are commanded to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. We are commanded to love and fear this God. Now, there's a different word for awe in the Greek language. Remember, this part of our Bible was originally written in the Greek language of the time. It's been translated into English. There's a different word that our translators usually translate as awe, sometimes as godly fear. And that just means more of an awe. But Jesus chose to use the word here, phobos, terrified, dread. Like I said, it's like a phobia. The difference between acrophobia, fear of heights, and just being uncomfortable with being in a high spot. The part where you cannot function anymore because of that phobia. You're terrified versus just not comfortable. On the lake in Matthew chapter 8, when Jesus is in the boat asleep, right, and they're going across the lake, and that big storm comes, and the disciples are so afraid that they wake Jesus and say, "Don't you care? We're going to drown." And Jesus says to the disciples, "Why do you doubt and are afraid?" Jesus uses a different word in that moment that means to be cowardly and fearful. Not phobos, not dread. He uses a different word. There's multiple different words that Jesus could have used here in Luke for fear or awe, but he chose phobos. Bible Hub, the people at Bible Hub, in reference to the word that Jesus uses in Matthew 8 for cowardly and fearful, they write, it's always used in a negative sense. So it's always used in a negative sense. You know, cowardly or fearful. It's always used in a negative sense. In contrast to the positive fear of God expressed by phobos. So the people at Bible Hub see that those two different kinds of fear, one's a negative, always used in a negative context. The other one, in relative to fearing God, used in a positive context. So there's this positive fear of God that leads us to positive action. There's a negative kind of fear that makes us cower away from doing the hard thing. Cowardly. It paralyzes us and we can't move forward. Jesus here tells us to fear God with phobos, that fear and dread. And he makes it pretty clear that we should fear only God. Because verse 4, he says, I tell you, my friends, do not fear those who kill the body, and after that have nothing more that they can do. But I will warn you whom to fear. Fear him who, after he has killed, has authority to cast into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him. He's saying fear God and fear God only. Don't fear man. Don't fear anyone else. Only God has the authority or the power to cast anyone into hell. And frankly, he is the only one that has the power to keep anybody out of hell. And we're told to fear God and fear God only. We're told to fear God because he knows everything. Verses 1 through 3. Right? Nothing will be hidden. Nothing will be covered up. Whatever has been said in the dark shall be heard in the light. God knows everything, and he will reveal everything someday. We cannot hide from God, though we try. We cannot keep secrets from God, though we try. Again, verses 2 and 3 to me are terrifying. Maybe not in a phobos way, more of a cowardly negative way. In the idea that one day, my hypocrisy will be known. And Jesus tells us, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, in verse 2, or in verse 1. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. So Jesus tells us that the idea that we talked about the Pharisees last week, and how they looked all good on the outside, but inside Jesus said that they were full of greed and evil, right? They're different on the outside than how they really are on the inside. They appear to be one thing, but they are something else. And Jesus says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is that hypocrisy, appearing to be something that you're not. He says, beware of that, and he calls it leaven. Leaven, yeast, a little bit in a lump of dough works its way through the whole thing. That's what Jesus is getting at. Beware of the leaven of hypocrisy that will affect everything. It will eventually get into every area of your life. The bottom line is, I can really have no secrets. God knows everything. There's nothing I can hide from him. The bonus freebie for this morning, no extra charge for this. Hypocrisy, it's not in your notes. Hypocrisy is one area, will impact every area of my life. Hypocrisy in one area of my life will affect every area of my life. It's leaven that will work its way through everything. Fear God, only God. Fear God because he knows everything. Fear God because he has power over eternity. That's the clearest statement that Jesus makes here. Verse 5, I'll tell you who to fear. Fear the one who can cast you into hell. Jesus is telling us to fear God who has the power over eternity. We all know that in the beginning, God created mankind with perfect relationship with him. And then in the beginning, Adam and Eve chose to do the one thing God said they couldn't do by taking of that fruit. And then they sinned, and they caused sin to pervade all of humanity. And we all have that sin problem. In KFC, we call it the want to sin. We have this want to do things that are opposed to God. And we also say that it's anything that we think, say, or do that breaks God's law. That's sin. Anything that we do that's against God. We all have that, and we all have this want to carry that out. And that sin causes us to be separated from a holy God. We sang about a holy God this morning, right? That separates us from a perfect and holy God. We can't be in his fellowship. And the only way we can be back in his fellowship is to be free from sin. But we can't be free from sin, and we can't do anything to fix our sin problem except believing and trusting in what Jesus did on the cross. He has the authority to cast us into hell. It's his creation. We've rebelled against him. He has that authority. And he's provided the one and only way for us to not suffer that eternity separated from him. And that's through Jesus. Fear God because he has the power over eternity. Point two. You may not fear God if you are overly concerned with lack of provision. You may not fear God if you are overly concerned with lack of provision. Jesus goes from fear God to are not, in verse 6, 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies. And not one of them is forgotten by God. Why, even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, you are of more value than many sparrows. So Jesus is saying, fear God, not your material possessions, not your provision, don't be fearful of your circumstances, but fear God. You may not fear God if you are overly concerned with the lack of provision or baldness, for that matter, right? Jesus says this, even the number of our hairs. He said something different, but it was something about hairs and being numbered on our head. He said it better. Even that's covered. God knows all of the details about all of what we've got going on, right? And we're told to fear him, not be concerned about those things. You may not fear God if you don't acknowledge him. Right after that, Jesus goes into verse 8. He says, I tell you, everyone who acknowledges me before men, the Son of Man also will acknowledge before the angels of God. But the one who denies me before men will be denied before the angels of God. And everyone who speaks a word against the Son of Man will be forgiven. So Jesus is saying, look, fear God. Don't be afraid of those who oppose God. And in verse 11, and when they bring you before the synagogues and the rulers and authorities, do not be anxious about how you should defend yourself or what you should say. So he's painting the picture here that there is this chance that we as Christians will not speak about Jesus because they drag us before synagogues and rulers and question us about Jesus. So there's this, he paints the picture of persecution. And he's saying, if you deny me before men, I will deny you before the angels. So you may not fear God if you don't acknowledge him. You may have more fear of man and what they can do to you than God himself, which is where we started. Don't fear those who can kill your body and can't do anything else after that. Fear the one who, after he kills, has power over eternity. So you may not fear God if you're overly concerned with lack of provision. You may not fear God if you don't acknowledge him. And you may not fear God if the storms of life are debilitating. Remember we mentioned that Jesus and the 12 in the boat in Matthew chapter 8, and the fear they had of the storm and how they panicked and woke Jesus up. What Jesus wanted of them was to go across the lake. And then this storm came up, and that became their focus. They were no longer focused on the task at hand, but they were focused on the storm. What Jesus had said was, we're going across the lake. And now all they could focus on was the storm in their lives. You may not fear God if the storms of life are debilitating. See, if you are more concerned about the experience around you and the challenges of your life than you are of God, if you're more in awe of those things than him, if you're more fearful of those things than you are of him, then you may not fear God. Remember we talked about how the word phobos, that fear, causes positive action versus the cowardly fear that causes inaction? If we are more afraid of God than we are of our circumstances, we will act in spite of them. We will be obedient in spite of them. Third point is fear, be in awe of God more than your circumstances. Fear, be in awe of God more than your circumstances. So it doesn't matter really whether we call it fear or awe of God, as long as it's bigger than our circumstance. Jesus tells us to have a phobos, fear of God here, right? If you're uncomfortable with the idea of fearing God, well, then just be in awe of him to the point that you're more in awe of him than you are of the challenges around you. And that your awe for him overwhelms your fear of your challenges. It doesn't matter how you phrase it. It's all really the same. Is God bigger than your circumstances or not? Is God God or not? Can God handle it or not? In verses 4 and 5, we're told not to fear the one who can kill us, but fear the one who has power to send us to hell. In verses 6 and 7, we're told not to fear lack of provision, but fear the one who has the key to all that provision. In verses 8 through 12, we're told not to fear speaking about God, but fear the God we should be speaking about. So fear or be in awe of God more than the situation or circumstances that may be overwhelming to you. Let God overwhelm you versus the circumstances. Fourth point, more often than not, our actions prove our lack of fear of God. More often than not, our actions prove our lack of fear of God. When we don't do what God tells us to do, when there's a very clear command that says, Christian, do this, and we don't, because of what? Whatever, because we're not comfortable with it, or because we don't like the idea of it, or whatever it is, we just choose not to do it. But we know it's a command. When we choose to not do that, that proves our lack of fear for God. When we do something we know God has said not to do, that again proves our lack of fear for God. That proves that we are putting more stock in whatever that is than we are in God. More often than not, our actions prove our lack of fear for God. When we don't trust Him to provide for our needs, like He does for the sparrow, and we take a different course of action to try to provide for ourselves that violates something maybe He said in His law, or violates some clear command He's given us, or violates a conviction that He's given us. When we do things the old worldly way, when life presses in on us, and instead of turning to God and asking Him what to do, we just turn to do what it is that we've always done in the past. When we can't sleep at night due to the circumstances around us, and that's all we can focus on. Our actions prove our lack of a fear for God. When our circumstances paralyze us. When the trials of life and the storms of life are so bad that we are now paralyzed by that fear. We prove our lack of fear for God. Jesus contrasts fearing people who want to persecute us or do us harm or who can kill us. He contrasts that with fearing God, who has power over eternity. And he contrasts fearing those who might persecute us for our faith with God who gives us the words in the moment to speak out on behalf of Him. He contrasts our fear of provision with the God who provides. The question for us is, do we really believe in a God who's in control? Do we really believe in a God who cares more about us than He does a sparrow? Which is what Jesus says. We are of more value than many sparrows, which is good because 5 sparrows is sold for 2 pennies, and I don't want to be worth just that. But Jesus tells us we're of more value, and He cares for them. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, do we love God? Do we fear God? Or do we fear lack of something else? Do we fear what people might do to us? Or do we fear God? And again, phobos, this fear of God, a very real thing that Jesus tells us to do, contrasted with a cowardly fear that paralyzes us. Phobos, fear, creates positive action. So as we wrap up today and we talk about the fear of God, the fear of God should not be a debilitating fear, but a fear that causes positive action. And again, there's that contrast between loving God and fearing God. And some of us are going to have a really hard time wrapping our head around the idea that I love something I fear. Or I fear something I love. Or I fear something that I believe to be all good and all loving. But we're told to fear God with that kind of a fear. Because He is God. And yes, we can call Him Abba, Daddy. He's called us His children. We have that right. We have that privilege. We have that ability. But at the same time, we can't take Him lightly or flippantly. When He commands, we should go. When He commands, we should do. He is God. And we should fear Him. Let me pray for us.